Welcome to Blueprint to Billions, Leverage and Legacy in Apartments.
Welcome back to Season 2 of Blueprint to Billions, where legal strategy meets real estate scale. HUD attorney and multifamily housing strategist Terry Bruner has spent his career guiding developers, nonprofits, and investors through complex housing transactions with a focus on building both legacy and leverage. I'm Evan Mackin, and today we're stepping back to the foundation. Everyone talks about generational wealth, but few agree on what that actually means. Today, Terry will break down the myths, share how different generations view wealth, and explain why real estate, especially HUD deals, can shift the story for families and communities. Welcome back, Terry, sir. This is Season 2 of Blueprint to Billions. How you doing?
What happened to Season 1?
Listen, I didn't even know we was in Season 2, but I'm glad I like that I like that we're doing seasons, you know what I mean? Let's keep the show going.
That's right. It's good to be back. It's good to be. I've missed you, Evan.
Missed you too. It really did. But listen, so look, we're getting kind of deeper into certain things that we've kind of talked about in the past. But look, let's kind of kick off with the basics when it comes to wealth. When you say generational wealth, what do you mean and what do you not mean?
Let's see. What I don't mean is anything that's fleeting. So I'm sure that your collection of vintage sneakers are wonderful, but that's typically not what we think of when we think of generational wealth. And I'm obviously making light, but really what we're talking about wealth that can be passed down. And something that survives you. There's a famous quote that says, "We are what survives us." And so for many of us, we think about legacy in the sense of, our children and our grandchildren and our great grandchildren and so forth and so on. And so they carry forth a certain segment of your bloodline, a certain segment of your gene pool. And for some of us, you're like, oh God, somebody's walking around with my genes. But in any case, you're thinking about passing things along. Well, it's no different when it comes to wealth, and it's no different when it comes to assets. We are in the business of assisting clients really amassing particularly real estate assets so that those things can be bundled, packaged, sold, or conveyed down the line to a generation that long survives you. So in many cases, even beyond 2 generations, sometimes even beyond 3. That's what we mean when we say generational.
But a lot of people think that wealth is kind of having rich parents. But why is that possibly an oversimplification, and even misleading at times?
Well, in some ways it's not even American. It certainly doesn't conflate with the American dream. But I think in some respects, and I don't mean this in any sort of negative way, in some respects it's a cop out. The thinking goes that unless I was born on third base, it may not be possible. And obviously there are different things that happen as we go through life, but I know plenty of clients that I work with, plenty of friends that I have, many of whom are older. They started out in a relatively meager state in life. And through discipline and hard work and some saving, and yes, some lucky breaks along the way, they've been able to, rise above the social status or the economic status where they may have been born. So when I hear people say, you need rich parents in order to do X, Y, or Z, it doesn't really congeal with the lived experience that I've seen so many of our clients have. We've got, at this firm, we have many people who, essentially their parents bought something and now they're passing those assets down to their children. And now they've got, a third generation who are working in the business, who are either managing those assets or actively in the process of acquiring more. And so while it helps, yes, to have, wealth in your family to start out with, for many people, that wasn't the case. They started where they were and they started just amassing as they went. So it helps, yes, but it's not necessary. It's not necessarily required.
Do you feel that can kind of hurt sometimes as well? Because I know stories where people get passed down something, but still are not able to continue that legacy, or not able to be disciplined and good with the money and not continue that generational wealth.
Oh, absolutely. So I see it all the time. There's a word we use in real estate called gentrification. And sometimes it's a bad word because it's loaded with so many connotations.
Absolutely.
But we see older neighborhoods that are either transitioning or they have been blighted and abandoned. And so what were once prosperous areas and prosperous, real estate assets, they have taken a hit, or in some cases, when the passage goes from one generation to the next, maybe the next generation is not savvy enough to really manage those assets. They lose them to things like taxes and other liens that may fall, that may harm the property. And so, yeah, we do see plenty of instances where the next generation wasn't necessarily set up for that
Hmm.
to occur. In some respects, though, it is a function. Again, sometimes you can't paint with too broad a brush, but sometimes it's a function of the generation that came before them not
Hmm.
really prepping them enough to step in to the business side of things in order to protect those assets as they continue. So when we speak about the generational pass down, it's not just about amassing or acquiring an asset and then passing it down. It's also giving the next generation or generations the kind of literacy and education necessary to hold on to those assets. That's equally as important.
So you work with multiple generations in your deals. How does that perspective shift when you're talking to Gen Z or boomers about wealth?
Okay, so I'll give you an example from a family client that we have. They actually have a family office, and many of those boomer generations, they see wealth from the perspective of fixed assets. So they may not be heavily invested in the stock market, for example, but they have an incredible amount of land holdings, an incredible amount of real estate holdings, and a significant number of assets that are passed in what we call outside of probate. So not so things that you could things that are probably titled in a different way, and so there's no official record of them in terms of a deed or something like that, but they have other assets that may be fixed. What I find with younger generations, and I'm talking about Zers, for example, they don't see real estate in the same way. I mean, just to be frank about it, they are even on the fence as to whether or not they should invest in a single family house or
Yeah.
buy a condo. Now
Yeah,
we've
that's
talked
that's
about
the
this
new thing
before.
I've been reading about that, Terry, as far as like the new generations not valuing homes as that end all be all like other generations have.
Yeah. And so what I'm recognizing, even in the apartment space, is that for a lot of Zers, for example, they aren't necessarily interested in the same asset allocation as maybe their parents or grandparents were. They're thinking more about cryptocurrency. They're thinking
Mhm.
about getting in the market in a different way. If they are interested in real estate, maybe they're interested in REITs, which is a fancy way of, it's like a mutual fund for real estate. They're thinking of it in that way, but they're not necessarily thinking of, I need to go amass one apartment, two apartments, three apartments, four apartments, or one house, then two houses, and three houses. They're not even thinking in the same way about flipping. Flipping was a big deal
Yeah.
20 years ago. Everyone, it seems like, was into flipping, and many of the other generations. I won't say that they're not interested in wealth. They are, but they're seeing a different pathway,
Mm.
somewhat because of the change time, somewhat because of maybe the economy and just the fluctuations that are going forward. And I think some of it just because of lifestyle changes. They're just seeing wealth creation and generation in a different way.
But so why is real estate and specifically HUD deals such a powerful, lever for building wealth that lasts beyond one lifetime and can go to transcend different generations?
Well, I'm laughing because I always go back to that statement my law professor made. They're not making any more dirt.
That's what I
So,
say. That's the truth.
and I know it's just like, okay, well, that's such a crass, glib way of looking at things, but it's true.
Mhm.
It's supply and demand. So to the extent that there are just limited numbers of acres or limited numbers of things that you can purchase, in
Okay.
some ways that lack of supply is going to drive a different set of demands. I think, and in my family, we're invested in a lot of things. Like, we're in the market just like a lot of people are. But in my lifetime, what I have seen, even in my own family, is that, one, there's sentimentality that's associated with real estate. Like, there's something wonderful about being able to go to your grandparents' house on a holiday, or something great about if you've got land in your family that's been there forever, for generations upon generations, and that
Mhm.
land generates stories. We connect with the land and a place largely through what's there. So there is the sentimental aspect of it, but there's also just the very real notion that if you buy an apartment complex, for example, when it's new, assuming that it's constructed in the right way, you've probably got 50 or 60 years of shelf life on that building. And you've got multiple units in that building that you can continue to turn and continue to make profit off of those units for 50 or 60 years. And if it's built really, really well, you could get even 100 years out of it. Now, obviously, you're going to have to make some upgrades and do some repairs and have some substantial, things that rehabilitation work that's done. But the fact that you're generating multiples of income over generations, over successive years, you're very hard pressed to find that any place else outside of multifamily housing.
So where do most families or even communities go wrong in thinking about this wealth transfer?
I think they think of it too myopically, for one. So they think of it as like a one and done, sort of thing. And I get it. I think if we were having this conversation years ago, we would probably say something around like, well, the average lifespan is, maybe 65 years. And, and so your calculation around like how you're going to live your life, even retirement, you think about, I think the minimum age that someone can withdraw Social Security is 62. And, that was set many generations ago, largely because the thinking was that if somebody lives to 70, oof, man, they've lived a long life.
It's true.
Like it's not uncommon now for people to live well into their upper 80s, in some cases their early 90s. And so the wealth transfer that would have happened maybe 50 years ago, even 40 years ago, it's going to look a lot different now. And so you actually have families now where you're not just talking about generation 1, 2, and 3, but maybe you're talking about generations 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so transferring that wealth down through the generations, again, it's going to look a lot different than for someone who is expecting to pass on at 65. So I think people are very myopically focused on that transfer. I think the second thing, which is to kind of bring it in our wheelhouse, it's poorly planned, those transfers. There are all sorts of inheritance taxes, gift taxes, the so-called death taxes. Like all of those things need to be planned for. And while I'm certainly not going to give you financial advice, it is important to start planning, relatively early for what this actually is going to look like, so that as people live longer and as families grow in size, through the generational aspect of it, you actually can make a concerted plan for what that transfer looks like, in a way so that, frankly, Uncle Sam's not going to take most of it, but it's going to stay in the family, which is what you built it for to begin with.
Absolutely. So legacy versus lifestyle, though, Terry. How do you balance building for today without robbing tomorrow?
Well, listen, I have my passions just as anyone. My family, they have their passions just as anyone. So I would never begrudge anyone to say, don't live life to the fullest.
Right.
But as with most things, it is about moderation. You have to do a little bit of everything so that you can preserve some of the main things that you want. And
Right.
I guess, like if the mix or the calculus is about short-term gratification versus long-term gain, you've got to find whatever the happy medium is in that for you and for your situation. So, the plenty of clients, would-be clients, I should say, come to me. Many are younger, and they say, we want to get in on the deals that TBLO is doing. So we want to go buy an apartment complex, and we want to have 300 units, and we know it's going to cost us $40 million. We don't have $40 million, but we're going to go do that anyway. Well, the problem with doing that is you got to start someplace.
Yeah.
And if you don't have $40 million, then what you might end up having to do is maybe you go buy something smaller, a duplex, maybe a nice house, maybe a triplex, and then you want to multiply that over time.
Right.
That's not the sort of short-term gratification of getting the $40 million apartment complex, but you're foregoing a little bit of pleasure in terms of really, really stretching. And I know this is an extreme example. You're foregoing a little bit of pleasure now so that ultimately you will be in a position to get where you want to go.
Hmm.
So by all means, you want to go buy the nice car, you want to have the nice clothes, you want to do whatever it is that your passions are, do a little bit of that, but plan for it. But don't ever lose sight of what you're trying to build long term. And so I think if you start, the best thing about starting early is you've got time on your side and
Right.
you've got compounding interest on your side, right? So if you start early enough with a plan, you can certainly try to work that plan sufficiently enough throughout life so that you're actually able to do something when you become of age, whatever of age is. So it is a balance. It's the classic balancing test around a little bit now for a whole lot later. And that's
Hmm.
hard to do. I understand that. But the people who do this best, the people who build the most generational wealth, they may not wear the latest fad or the latest fashion, but they're building wealth behind the scenes. And if I have one piece of sobering advice, that's probably it.
Wow. Good stuff. So Terry, can you share a story of a deal or a client where generational thinking or maybe even lack of that thinking made or broke the outcome?
Yeah, it's probably an amalgam of both. I'll give you an example of a client family that we have. The family's three generations. Business was started by the grandfather and that generation. Then it was passed to the second generation, mostly through the son, who was in that generation, and then that son had two sons of his own, and so now we're in the world where those two sons are essentially now trying to inherit the assets and the business from from their father. Look, no surprise, those of us who are sons, we like to do things differently than our fathers,
Yep.
and there's always going to be a little bit of healthy conflict there, even though father loves sons and sons love father, right? What I have seen is in the sense of their portfolio, multiple properties, multiple deals, and numbers of units that number into the thousands. What I've seen with them is that dad has a certain way of approaching business decisions. Sons have a certain way of approaching business decisions. Dad is really of the mindset that, well, what we did to build the portfolio some years ago is not what we need to do now to maintain the portfolio. The Suns are more aggressive, and the Suns are saying, no, this is a perfect time to continue to grow the portfolio and not just stop.
Hmm.
And so we've seen a little bit of healthy tension there because you do need both sides here to figure out where you're ultimately going to land in this. So I think dad is of the opinion that no, we're good where we are. We just need to maintain. The sons again are saying, hey, in the iteration of our lives where we are, we've got to continue to grow this so
Hmm.
that our children then, that next generation, that they're going to have even more than we had because
Hmm.
that's what it's going to take. So while it hasn't necessarily killed any deals per se, what I have seen is that the paralysis of the decision making, that paralysis has absolutely caused the family not to move forward on some things that they could have moved forward on in a way that probably would be accretive to them now had they moved on.
Terry, you often say wealth isn't just money. What else belongs in that definition, though?
I think it's whatever is profitable to you, Evan. So if time is profitable to you,
Right.
then there's a wealth of time. If
Right.
relationships are profitable for you, then there's a wealth in relationships. Whatever it is that you deem as important for life and how you're going to pass down those core values and those sense that sense of who you are, that's just as important as money. And in fact, the old adage, time is money. What I found is if you have enough time in life, that typically creates the space for you to figure out more ideas, which may ultimately lead to more money. So I
Right.
think when you go into any sort of deal, whether it's a real estate deal or any deal, you've got to think about it in the sense of whether or not it's actually going to be profitable for your overall goals. But that means you got to start somewhere. And what I'm finding increasingly is that people come with ideas, but they don't really have a sense of where they want to start and then where
Hmm.
they want to end. That's
Hmm.
that's why if money is the only driver, there's going to be an issue.
So Terry, tease us forward next time we talk about how to start building this. What's the mindset shift listeners should make before we dive into the tactics per se?
Oh, I think really being committed to the why is so important. There's a great book. I think it's by Simon Sinek. It start with why. You got to understand why you're doing what you're doing. The why to me is always more important than the how, because you can figure out the how as you go along, but you got to always start with why you want whatever it is you want. So if you say you want to build generational wealth, why is that important to you?
Wow.
And it's sort of like business planning, right? So if you say I want a business that makes me X number of dollars, those numbers sound great, but if they're not tethered to something real, they're just going to be numbers on a sheet of paper. And it's the same thing for real estate. If they're not tethered to some real, tangible idea, goal, objective, something, again, it's just going to be there, taking space and nothing more. So I'd start with a why.
Terry, sir, appreciate the time as always.
Pleasure, Evan.
And thank you all so much for tuning in to Blueprint to Billions. If you're navigating HUD-backed development and want to elevate your credibility from day one, connect with Terry at terrybrunerlaw.com. And if you're an attorney looking to build a legal practice on your own terms, outside of the big firm pressure, and into a niche that actually reflects your values, check out Terry's course at thenichepractice.com. Subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who's ready to lead with clarity and not just credentials. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.